and bamboozled the UK was, after what has felt like an eon of what is a woman, we find ourselves in a new epoch of certainty to that question for some, but of heightened anxiety for many, many others. At the time of writing the script, I have observed a concerted effort to dismantle trans people's access to healthcare, especially trans children. We await the release and ministerial approval of new government guidance to redefine the trans people's access to public spaces after a landmark ruling defining what a woman is in law. We have reached a point in the UK where we directly echo Section 28, statutory guidance, relationship and sexual education in schools, which attempts to eliminate trans identities from the picture, even if it isn't outright banned. Certain celebrities can be arrested for inciting sexual violence against trans people, but they are heralded as martyrs of the so-called gender-critical feminist movement. The whole circus of headlines is cruel and emotional, and is basically the whole reason why I've struggled to make this essay for a year. It isn't just a discussion for many of us looking at you, Sex Matters, LGB Alliance, Women for Scotland, GenSpec, Transgender Trend, CanSG, Bayswater Support Group, or Anna Hutchinson's Integrated Psychology Clinic. And yet current events have transpired such that you have the ears of ministers and even the ability to meet with top government officials like the current health secretary in charge of the NHS treatment of trans people. That's right. Names which have been identified as meaningfully connected to the alt-right Christian nationalism, peddling pseudoscience in the United States to promote anti-trans agendas. Hell, as I write this script, the PM has recently appointed a trustee of Sex Matters as his chief communications secretary. And the EHRC has just submitted their updated code of practice to the Minister for Women Equalities, and the media reports of it are not optimistic. At this point, let's apply what we have learned to understand how it is the UK has got to this point, which can be broadly exemplified by the Cass Review and the recent Supreme Court ruling in the UK. I shall not be presenting a comprehensive overview of the Cass Review, all its arguments, or the swathe of critiques levied upon it by medical and scientific bodies across the world. More importantly for this discussion I wish to have is how the Cass Review is being applied to advance transphobic discourse, calling upon science as a rhetorical device rather than discussing it with full understanding of the scientific method. After all, with the review being applied in this way, most of its supporters are unlikely to care about such critiques were I to bring them up yet again, and its opponents are almost certainly aware of them anyway. For further context, I recommend reviewing these videos on screen now. It's okay, I'll wait for you. However, I do want to mention two things about the Cass Review which are also employed to manipulate the narrative further or legitimize certain conclusions. The first is that Cass herself was chosen to head the review panel because of her absence of clinical experience with gender-affirming healthcare, and is therefore an impartial figure to review the available evidence. This doesn't seem to be the case. Instead, it seems she was known to be skeptical of medical transition by colleagues from the start. In an article written by two NHS clinicians, Doctors Davey and Hobbs, Dr. Davey, who had previously worked with Dr. Cass on another NICE working group on medical transition prior to the Cass Review, separate, not the same thing, recalls a conversation she had with Cass to discuss potential involvement within her review. So let's hear from her. Quote, "During the call, she expressed concerns about GIDS practice. She expressed the view that it was shocking that 97% of children who went onto puberty blockers then progressed to gender-affirming hormones in the GIDS service. I suggested that this might have been due to accurate triage. She recommended that I read Irreversible Damage. The call ended, and I never heard anything about involvement in the review. This is my recollection of the conversation. It may be that Dr. Cass has a different recollection. It is important to note that I am not saying that Dr. Cass did not have a right to her opinions on transition. She did not explicitly state that she had read Irreversible Damage or that she endorsed everything in it. I am not saying that having pre-existing opinions on medical transition disqualified her as chair of the review. However, I still maintain that the content and tone of the conversation is not consistent with a statement subsequently made in the New Statesman interview that she went into the review at the end of 2020 with no preconceived notions. End quote. Now you may say, but this is just anecdotal, or maybe she really was impartial but just curious. Okay, well, my response would be to look at the review itself, and one rather particular critique which is raised several times. That is the way transness is presented as somehow less preferable than remaining cis. That is to say, you don't transition. The review itself was designed with a preference to cisgender professionals without experience in gender healthcare. Language within the review itself maintains a delegitimization of youth's trans identities, misgendering them and characterizing them by their birth sex. Not only is this disrespectful of a review purporting to support the improvement of health outcomes in youth gender services, this demonstrates strong cisnormative bias. So strong is this bias that all trans professionals are listed as other, compared to their male and female colleagues, and all trans children reduced to gender questioning young people. This incorrectly conflates settled and stable trans children in their identities with those who are questioning, permitting the review to erase trans identities entirely and instead reframe the question to one of the persistence of gender incongruence throughout a child's life and then into adulthood. This brings me on to the second related point, which is that there is weak evidence supposedly letting down children in gender healthcare. Of course, by starting from a cis-supremic standing point, this argument is rather easy to maintain, even if false. However, the way this has been done has been criticised for how the review evaluates evidence and its quality. The review designates evidence as weak or poor, but this is criticised as ambiguous given the review's absence of definitions for quality evidence. And in discussing such weak evidence, the review often lends too much weight to flawed evidence of widespread social contagion, detransition, and dissidence. Such discussions, of course, have also been the wheelhouse of many pseudoscientists and the prop to many anti-trans advocates and transphobic narratives discussed in the previous video. This includes the narrative of UK gender-critical groups like LGBT Alliance and Sex Matters, and who found an ally in Kemi Badenoch back when she was Women and Equalities Minister in the previous government. Interestingly, I think, that she talks about the Cass review in the same breath as planting gender-critical voices in government positions regarding equalities and health. Quote, "The third reason was having gender-critical men and women in UK government holding the positions that mattered most in equalities and health. You only need to look at what the SNP did in Scotland to see what would have happened had we not intervened. The Cass review would never have been commissioned under a Labour government. Labour did not want to know. We had incredible opposition from the system on everything. It was when the ministers changed that everything changed. In short, I, as do many others, think the Cass Review is an example of pre-existing bias coming to the fore to make ill-informed conclusions regarding healthcare. There is a parallel we can draw here in recent medical British history, the natural birth scandal. In effect, the natural birth scandal was the result of a decision made along ideological lines in order to deprive a group of people autonomy or free choice in some part of their healthcare. This then led to the development of unscientifically backed targets in maternity care at Shrewsbury and Telford Hospital NHS Trust. As Lady Hale said in her judgment on Montgomery's case, some obstetricians felt that a vaginal delivery in some way morally preferable to a caesarean section. So much so that it justifies depriving the pregnant women of the information needed for her to make a free choice. Between 1973 and 2020, the insistence upon births by natural delivery in order to maintain some arbitrary natural birth rate target led to systemic failures in healthcare, including multiple preventable deaths of newborn babies. Even if you think the methodology is completely fine, the Cass Review, has since been used as a lightning rod on both sides of the pond. GenSpect, SEGM, Heritage, LGB Alliance, Sex Matters, the list goes on. Most importantly, it has resulted in a ban of puberty blockers, the announcement of ethically dubious, at best, studies on trans kids, and the announcement of a review into adult trans healthcare. The very notion of this latter point is frightening, if not just because of rhetoric which attempts to infantilize us, such as an implication to rewrite adult as over 25, specifically for trans people. As a consequence of the so-named independent Cass Review, government figures in the UK repeatedly point to it as justification for the current stymie of transgender healthcare. Pending further reviews and ongoing clinical trials, as recommended by the Cass Review, the treatment some trans children have received till now is no more. And we will continue trying to close loopholes to protect children. This is done to, in the effect of drawing a line under an entire field of discussion. Never mind a range of ethical and evidential concerns with the Cass Review, or current policies by the Department of Health and Social Care, or anxiety from parents and children who are being impacted right now. No official is willing to engage. Even in Parliament, where discussion is supposed to flow free, ministers ignore questions from MPs casting some major shadows of doubt over the whole policy direction, and instead reassert that it is an independent, scientifically backed Cass Review. Forgive me if I am wrong here, but I thought scientific rigour required one to convince others of the conclusions through the facts and address shortcomings as they come, rather than just blindly demand faith. I mean, remember, science is rhetoric but not substance? Here it is. The purpose of the Cass Review is not to facilitate a nuanced discussion amongst researchers and medical practitioners, but to be wielded as a blunt instrument of control. To be honest, it reminds me a little bit of the discussions raised by ex-cultists or critiques of cults on the internet. They just want to disengage from dissenting critique to main power and keep the cult going strong. Yet, beyond the UK government, the Cass Review is now a top-rated source in anti-trans advocacy groups such as Sex Matters and LGB Alliance. Further still, it is hailed by SEGM, CanSG, Transgender Trend, who use it to push the narratives in the US. Both sides of the Atlantic see anti-trans groups waving the Cass Review as a comfort blanket white flag. We are only citing the evidence, they say. while promoting alt-right conservatism. Regardless of what one believes the intent of the cast review was, it is undeniable that it has massively stoked the flames of bigotry, especially given the interconnectedness of groups mentioned here who promote, endorse, and support each other. Now here is where you might ask, but the UK anti-trans movement is not about alt-right conservative values, it's about women and girls. We recently saw the UK Supreme Court rule in favour of for Women Scotland, defining women to mean biological women within the Equality Act. Leave aside the discussion of feminist thinkers like Butler for the moment. The case has been open and is now shut with confidence. As with the cast review, it hasn't taken long for transphobic organisations to use it to justify their bigotry, nor has UK government and public bodies waited in producing an outcome. The UK's statutory body on equality and human rights, the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, or EHRC, quickly published its draft updated guidelines on the Equality Act for public consultation, only to close 6 weeks later. Then announced it will be using AI to scan through the over 50,000 responses they received. A friendly reminder that the impact these statutory changes could have on trans people is quite profound. Already, increased self-policing of bathrooms around the country has been reported since the court ruling, including for a significant number of cis women. That is to say, biological women who the ruling for Women Scotland is meant to serve. Yeah, this is potentially just a sliver of what could come for trans people who could suddenly lose a range of legal protections, explicitly or otherwise. I shan't delve into this, but a good summary of my anger can be seen in my reaction I posted on the day of the court ruling. Yet, my point is this. This court ruling is being used to justify some rather big and personal changes to trans people's lives. Thus, our responses to the consultation are far more likely to be individualised and feature a wider range of unique points than those made by impartial or even anti-trans respondents. The small time frame, AI-driven examination of consultation feedback, how confident can we be that the consultation has been designed or will be executed such as to support trans people in the final statutory guidance? Hear their voices. I, for one, am not. It stands to reason that in practice, the Supreme Court ruling hasn't prompted relevant actors and authorities to adequately consider the balance of rights and privileges between people of all genders, trans or cis, but rather as a legal tool to instead address the rights of women above that of trans people. This doesn't exist in a vacuum, of course. As observed in my video reaction to the court ruling in the first place, the Supreme Court permitted quite a few interveners to provide evidence on the case. This included the EHRC, who I'll classify as officially neutral on the issue, but as I've said, have seen increasing numbers of trans exclusionary voices within its ranks, as admitted by the previous Women and Equalities Minister Kemi Badenoch. Only one voice was permitted to intervene in support of trans people, and that was Amnesty International, who aren't even trans-specific, despite the amazing work they do, and who are only permitted to submit written evidence to the court. On the other side was a combination of responses from Scottish Lesbians, the Lesbian Project, LGBT Alliance, and Sex Matters. The narrative manipulation these groups have provided elsewhere can largely be classed into two categories: the transing away of gay identity and pitting trans rights as antithetical to the safety of women and girls. LGBT Alliance have been absolutely central to this notion that trans people are an existential threat to LGBT rights, focusing on trans people as a social contagion, or transness being the result of a faulty medical establishment not protecting kids under the rest of the rainbow. Of course, they cite GenSpect and SEGM. Evidently, this narrative typology they have propelled has found ears in the mainstream. I mean, in 2021, the BBC released its brazenly transphobic article headlined, "We're being pressured into sex by some trans women."
Hello, this is me from the edit. In the following, I incorrectly name Lily Cade as the author of this article. She is in fact quoted in this article as one of the women being pressured into sex by some trans women. So sorry for the confusion, but hopefully the rest of my points still hold. Thank you, and hope you enjoy the rest.
This was written by Lily Cade, who later called for violence to be committed against celebrity trans women, including a call for them to be lynched. How white supremacist of you. I could bring up how the article failed to uphold standards on statistical rigor or journalistic integrity. The headline has since been changed, by the way. But surely knowing that this is the mentality of the article's author should be sufficient to question the quality of what the article states. Sadly, it seems the discussion hasn't slowed and instead has done the opposite. Between them and the Supreme Court ruling this year, I remember several discussions by politicians who referred to the idea of protecting lesbian rights, including a Westminster Hall debate in June 2023 on the legislative definition of sex, in response to 2 e-petitions on the issue. One, for the amendment of the Equality Act to be based on biological sex, and seemingly set up and promoted by Sex Matters, with the other seeming to be made to combat it. It also interestingly took place at the same time as the 4 Women Scotland case was originally being heard in the Scottish courts. One of the discussion points by SNP MP Joanna Cherry, who has declared herself as being on the advisory group of Sex Matters, said this, quote, "In the short time I have, I want to focus on the rights of lesbians and gay men to be same-sex and not same-gender attracted, and on our right to freedom of association. The protected characteristic of sexual orientation is contingent on the definition of sex as meaning biological sex. Lesbians, gay men, and bisexual people all experience same-sex attraction. That is, attraction based on biological sex, not gender identity. As a lesbian, I think I can speak with some authority on this issue. Gender identity is not relevant to sexual attraction," end quote. With the lived experience of trans people and even the notion of gender identity poo-pooed, she follows up by using a dog whistle of males who can identify as lesbians to highlight trans women in particular as a threat to real lesbians. Quote, "Note that it, Stonewall, explicitly includes cross-dressers within the definition of transgender. This means that many males now self-define as lesbians. Under this climate, it is impossible for lesbians to meet and gather openly without men wishing to join us or disrupt our events. In the words of Anne Lister, lesbians love and only love their fairer sex. It is unacceptable that we should be forced to include men in our groups and our dating pool. Indeed, it is outright homophobia, as lesbian sexual orientation is exclusive of males as it is based on biological sex," end quote. It is abundantly clear that this one form of narrative manipulation relies on the other, since these arguments about lesbian safety necessitate that sex be heralded as the immutable determining factor to womanhood. This is where Sex Matters bears its relevance. Since Maya Forstater's legal case in 2023, which saw gender-critical belief become enshrined as protected in UK law, i.e. calling her a straight-up transphobe instead could be considered harassment yet she can just call me a man, and her co-founding of Sex Matters, this has been one of the most potent dog whistles in the discussion of anti-trans talking points. Excuse me, I am not a transphobe, I'm a gender critical. Where a lot of the backbone behind this gender critical movement has come from is best exemplified by the group's slogan. Sex matters in life and in law. It shouldn't take courage to say so. They assert that sex is not only a fundamental trait which needs to be protected, but a simple one. Quote, "It is easy and safe to speak about biology. The ordinary truth about the two sexes can be expressed without confusion or stigma. Law and policy are clear about the sexes. Protection against sex discrimination is understood as important." End quote. The colour they like to think themselves as pointing is one of simplicity, common sense, truth. Meanwhile, they claim they're a human rights group. Quote, "I do not believe it is incompatible to recognise that human beings cannot change sex while also protecting the human rights of people who identify as transgender." End quote. But they are persistent in rhetorical speech, which at least suggests that trans people or even gender identity are dangerous. Quote, "Expressing beliefs that are worthy of respect in a democratic society does not mean always being polite and measured. It does not require being able to point to academic references. It does not mean having to pull your punches. You should still be able to call out abuse, boundary pushing, and sexual paraphilia." End quote. The implication is that sex matters and gender critical beliefs are common sense, reasonable opinions, while anyone opposed to them is intolerant or even a threat. The narrative promoted by Sex Matters further legitimizes itself by claiming to be scientifically backed, but this itself relies on an incredibly simplified view of biological sex, and is ironic given they said they shouldn't even need to quote academic sources. They even spare us the job of evidencing this by referencing publications which begin to push the envelope on the idea that sex is more complicated than what we are taught in secondary school introductory biology. But instead of acknowledging and engaging with the scientific question, they commit a bad faith move by misrepresenting the modern development of biology into a political one. Quote, "Arguments are made that because there are rare developmental conditions associated with anomalous chromosomal combinations or resulting in ambiguous sex characteristics, the categories male and female exist on a spectrum or simply social constructs. Such attempts to reframe sex as a social construct are harmful to scientific discourse and research and to the ability to discuss the social implications of the reality of sex." End quote. Yeah, sure. I mean, imagine if physics were questioned in this way. You're taught in school that everything is made up of atoms, which contain nuclei of protons and neutrons. At university level physics, we learn that there are further smaller, more fundamental particles called quarks, which make these up. Oh, but we can't actually see them because quantum chromodynamics, and oh yeah, the ordinary matter content we know and love is probably only 5% of the total universe, so yeah, you've got us. We just like to play gotcha on the scientific method and fool you, and just play politics to get money, you know. Rather than go on further with this point and pull a Diogenes on them, I think one white elephant is not just in the room, but staring us right in the face. Amongst the anti-trans rhetoric, citing an interesting deluge of evidence, including Helen Joyce's book Trans, Where Ideology Meets Reality, Sex Matters just loves to define itself and its supposed feminist topology on sex. It is perhaps ironic to recall that Maya Firstarter was a co-founder of the Let Toys Be Toys campaign, which sought to break down narrow views of gender. Quote, "We believe that play is an intrinsic part of child development and can help shape long-term attitudes and ambitions. When toys and books are narrowly divided into boys and girls or by pink and blue, we risk limiting the possibilities and interests of our children." End quote. Ironic, because this 2012 campaign seems to make sense from a modern feminist perspective. While the sex-centric typology, sex matters practice seems archaic in comparison, how is it that trans-exclusive, gender-critical feminism can emerge from inclusivity as part of its history? How is it that feminism got to be so segregated? If you are clever and you watched a previous video, you might remember a previous lesson. It isn't about feminism. Indeed, the facade of feminism is but a tactic to manipulate the narrative alongside the gamut of messages used in anti-trans campaigning. Let's quote Judith Butler on this point. Quote, "I don't like gender critical because that phrase suggests that to be critical of gender is to be opposed to it, or to negate it in some way, but critical doesn't mean that. Critical theory, activity of critique, as Marx pointed out, is the practice of looking at the presuppositions we live with in everyday life and calling them into question." Right? I mean, he had this whole beautiful disquisition on this. Marx did in his early manuscripts. You know, what is the spirit of critique? We take certain things for granted. We take the market economy for granted. We take political economy for granted. And his whole critical method was to say, okay, let's take a look at the presuppositions and let's see whether they're necessary, how they got established, how they might change. So critique for me is a very dynamic process, and it also involves imagining the world otherwise. I think it is only very recently that critical, in the sense of gender critical, got reduced to just negation, or opposed, or don't like, an effect of aversion too. And that strikes me as unfortunate, because I do think gender theory can be part of critical theory, and so I'm critical. I'm gender critical. Maybe I should be called gender critical. End quote. Yet, feminism or not, well, motivated or not, coherent or not, the narrative pushed by LGBT Alliance and Sex Matters have found themselves in the public spotlight attached to a celebrity face. This celebrity face, she has bankrolled Sex Matters and provided not just her tacit support for people she has named her friends, but she has seemingly relished in actively lending her voice to the conversation. Actively provocative, she has posted transphobic harassment on Twitter and has sustained the dwindling flames of her franchise on conflating her transphobia to purchasing a new entry in it. Her billionaire celebrity status has undoubtedly made her not just a powerful ally, but effective marketing for the concerted anti-trans efforts in the UK. She is loud and has a reach far greater than most trans people or allies trying to effect positive change for our communities. J.K. Rowling and Maya Forstater are further alike, given that both have taken the effort to describe themselves as victims in their efforts for women's sex-based rights. Forstater with her consequential legal case, which was the result of her being dismissed for her gender-critical views, and Rowling for being abandoned by certain cast members she arguably helped make famous, or writing books under a pseudonym which portray transphobes as the real victims. A pseudonym which seems to echo one Robert Galbraith Heath, who literally fried gay people's brains, and clearly a male pen name of a female author. Yet, despite being victims of some transphobic row culture, both are extraordinarily rich people who have had a great deal of influence over British anti-trans activities in law, politics, and the media. Can anyone take their claim seriously? That members of transphobic organisations are systemic victims of some pro-trans lobby when one is about to remake their franchise as an HBO's TV series and the other is the head of an organisation at the very front of ongoing change to legislation which may take away trans people's right to piss in public. Rather than being led by scrappy underdogs who have been neglected or kicked while they are down, groups like Sex Matters and LGBT Alliance have been welcomed into places of authority with open arms. Their testimonies accepted by politicians and their evidence accepted by the courts. While dressed in expensive suits and bourgeois buttons, sex matters celebrated on the steps of the Supreme Court, marking a moment where a powerful lobby group got all the more powerful, while trans advocacy groups can barely get a foot in the door. So what is it that the rich face of UK transphobia will do with this power? Why, only being racist, of course. Imane Khalif. Anyone remember her? Or has everyone conveniently forgotten the waves of attacks sent her way during her gold medal ascent in the Paris Olympics last year? The same people attacking trans people, including Sex Matters' J.K. Rowling, decided that they had the right to attack Imane Khalif using the same boilerplate rhetoric. Protect women's sports, protect fairness in sport, protect women from men. The trouble is, of course, that Imane Khalif is a cisgender athlete. There is no evidence of her being trans. Yet, she has been barred from competing because of recent changes to the rules on sex testing. Undoubtedly because of the pylon, and she refuses to submit. Yet, she is Algerian, and is far from the stereotype of womanhood that many anti-trans proponents like to echo. On the surface, I remember many commenting on her looks, claiming that she appeared quite masculine. These comments, I realised, were made by white people caught up by incredibly white Western narratives of gender. Where did this come from at this particular epoch in media and political consciousness? Did we just scratch a turf and find a fascist? In fact, yes, we did. The same alt-right conservatism which drives US transphobic narratives and in turn feeds narrative manipulation for transphobia in the UK, which claims to be feminist but is nothing of the sort, is fundamentally the brainchild of Christian nationalism and Western colonialism. Ergo, the same beliefs which power a concerted effort to police gender and specifically misalignment from cis-het normativity are the same ones which feed white supremacy. The flow of cash to uphold a traditional notion of sex and gender is limited to the tradition enforced by white Western colonizers who actively erased whole cultures whose pre-colonial expressions of identity were considered to be abhorrent or sinful. That is to say, the transphobia of today is rooted in Christian history and orthodoxy, which is itself self-limiting. The manipulation of narratives, aided by appeals to scientific authority, is nothing new. The whole field of eugenics was a pseudo-scientific enterprise expressly built atop racist colonial attitudes and applied to keep the echo chamber of hate not only legitimized but powerful. People automatically think of the Nazis, but indeed the very idea of correlation as a statistical metric was defined in Britain within the context of eugenics. Such research was powerful for defining what was considered acceptable, conflating their twisted morals for scientific integrity. The morals and ethics they held about race became the litmus test. Anyone who falls outside these limits, outside this litmus test of gender, is target for attack, which should be obvious to anyone who sees the news of cis women being attacked in bathrooms every time the discourse gets more toxic. Which is why it isn't about the science, or the evidence, or the safety of women and girls, or seeking clarity in law, or having a respectful debate about what the future looks like in Britain or further afield. Yet as the world sees a billionaire lighting a cigar in celebration of fear-mongering against trans people, us trans people have to contend with having been reduced to an issue, a debate, or a problem for the sake of respectful discourse. In my prelude to this essay, I presented some statements which I want to address because now as earnest as I was at the time, I've got mixed thoughts in hindsight. 1. British transphobia is not the same as American transphobia. There is a reason that the conversation has used critical or gender ideology instead of referring so directly to trans people. The euphemism likes to erase us more discreetly, in part because we still have the Equality Act, which explicitly protects the characteristic of gender reassignment. Attempts to redefine a law haven't and won't come easy because it is so explicit within the Act. Unfortunately, that is not to say that lawmakers won't try. And the traffic light? Yeah, I think there are differences between the two sides of the pond. Despite remarkable parallels in certain parts of the approaches used that I have hopefully addressed. As we approach the end of this video, I'll permit myself the opportunity to share some opinions which might explain this. To be clear, this is opinion, I'm not trying to insist this is fact. For starters, the UK is generally less litigious and religious than the US. Despite everything in the UK seeming to culminate in religious fervour amongst gender-critical success in the courts, maybe the build-up of all of this has been more reliant on narrative manipulation, appeals to emotion, at least until an appetite for the pseudo-scientific RMP tactics and lawyered-up advocacy was established. After all, sex matters, which is, in my opinion, the hub of feminist facade transphobia in the UK, was only founded after Maya Forstater managed to paint herself as a victim in the media. Unfortunately, gender-critical and for biological women are the key dog whistles in anti-trans discourse across the UK. A different focus, I think, of narrative manipulation to the US. That said, although the orders of priority might be different on both sides of the pond, this is little comfort to people like me who see transphobia from the States not only being mirrored in the UK, but advanced beyond it in some respects. Unfortunately, an appetite in the media and political classes for appeals to pseudo-scientific authority and legal challenges is also now established. We live in a very uncertain time. But on both sides of the pond, combating transphobic bad faith narratives seems to require one to behave respectfully within a legal and political system not designed to accommodate outsiders. Transphobic organisations across the Atlantic have weaponized law, research, morals to peddle colonial and racist bullet points and promote discourse where the emotion and personal nature of trans people are erased. All of this to wield power over the crowd and persuade them against the trans boogie monster, the big bad of modern life. 2. Trump is a wildcard presidential candidate who is less in line with the current government views than Biden. Polling in the UK also shows that the general public would not endorse him as president, opting instead for Kamala Harris. Although Labour politicians may try to distance themselves from past comments over Trump, they can't exactly take them back. And their underlying reasons for disagreement of the Donald are likely to still remain. We have to hope that Labour won't try to mirror the US in every aspect with Trump as president. To be clear, talking about the views of the UK, red flag. Me. Sorry to be a downer, but the political gap between Labour and Trump policy seems to get smaller day after day in many respects. I mean, perhaps I am being dramatic, but we have seen Starmer work hard to appease Trump rather than distance himself from him, and this is through reform, garnering more attention each week. It also seems fair to note that Labour policies are siding closer to those promoted by Farage, who is often likened to Trump by onlookers and even people supporting him each day. So yeah, that didn't age well. 3.
Hello, me again from the edit. In that previous video I called West Streeting an evangelical Christian. In fact, he's an Anglican. Sorry for that confusion, but hopefully the rest of my point still stands. Thank you.
The alternative right Christian ideology which degrades LGBTQ+ and women's rights in the US is far less prevalent in the UK. While West Streeting is an evangelical Christian, the general public are less religious than in the States, which means there doesn't exist the same alt-right Christian momentum to erase queer and women's rights. Within the UK, attitudes towards abortion remain positive, and I doubt politicians will have the courage to ban it in the same way as in the US. Although abortion rights are far from open and shut in the UK, a discussion for another time. Green light, I think. In June 2025, the de jure situation at least improved with a bill to mostly decriminalise abortions in England and Wales, such as in cases where abortions are self-administered beyond 24 weeks. This follows quite a lot of political and media momentum. While there are several asterisks to note with this is of course a move in the opposite direction of the trend shown in the United States. Many of the international groups with an interest in UK transphobia do also have a vested interest in seeing restrictions to abortion though. So of course it remains to be seen how this will play out in practice. But perhaps we can see more positive changes in areas such as these instead of demonising trans people in the name of women's rights. So, what is the solution? Do we rely on the courts or on a shake-up of the political establishment? Do we have to trust that we can get through by debating against the organisations who are after us, or the institutions who have been touched by them? Maybe. We can try. After all, politics is dynamic in response to more factors than just the trans issue. Yet I think appeals such as these can only work if we have space to re-inject our individuality instead of speaking out as a member of the trans issue, to be human rather than just the narrative to be debated. I aspire to be a little bit more like these brave young people. Trans kids deserve better. Give them a look-see. They may be little, but they refuse to engage with the four horsemen of respectability: the law, the research, the morals, and the crowd, on the terms established by others. They're not afraid to speak up, even if it looks less than respectable.